Okay, so up on the bench here we've got my friend Phil's Morini race bike, and he dropped this off on the way back from the rather ill-fated Brands Hatch meeting. But I've been checking a few things over. There's a few little bits and pieces that we want to sort out on it. So one of them is this foot peg and gear lever arrangement. One of my fluorescent tubes just gave up. Must get those replaced with LEDs like all the other lights. And this is standard Tarozzi fixed foot peg, and the early style gear lever, which would normally run forwards, is run in reverse to give a race pattern shift, so that's down for up, and this has the an advantage on the racetrack, that you're not trying to get your toes underneath the shift pedal whilst cranked over, which risks actually digging the side of your boot into the surface of the track. So as you know, as you're coming out of the corner, you're pushing down on the lever to upshift. But Phil doesn't have particularly big feet, and this distance here is a little bit long. So normally when you're running the Tarozzi rear sets, you'd be running a pedal on this section of the foot peg here, and a linkage forward. So I'm going to look into doing something with that setup. And around the other side, I sorted out an issue with the other foot peg, where the whole foot peg was actually loose in the mounting bracket, which was due to this originally having been set up with the folding foot pegs, which I believe the race regulations say you've got to have fixed foot pegs, and it using a different size mounting. This uses a bolt all the way through. The folding foot pegs have a stud which is large diameter, and the mounting bracket had been sleeved down, but the sleeve was longer than the thickness of the bracket, so you couldn't actually tighten the peg into the bracket properly. Another little issue that I'm going to look at is this is the cable mounting stop, and the pedal is actually coming up and hitting it, so you can't bring the pedal more level, and that's due to there normally being a spacer in here. For both foot pegs there's a little bit of a ground clearance issue, so we may look at remaking mounting plates and moving the pegs up a little, particularly as this one would have to move out in order to clear the stop, but there may be other ways of dealing with that. But in any case, the major thing I want to deal with at the moment is I'd noticed a problem with the front brakes, which is that the discs were actually rubbing on the calipers, and the whole front wheel was mounted slightly off. So I've had this all apart and I've put it back together again temporarily to show you the issue. If I zoom in, hopefully the lighting will allow me to... Okay, that's not too bad. Show you that I've got the disc pretty much centralised in the caliper. But if I now zoom in on the spacer, if I can get the right angle, let's try sliding the camera in closer. Yeah, there we go. You can see we've got a gap between the spacer that butts up against the wheel bearing and then mounts against the bottom of the fork leg. And if I start even just hand tightening the nut to draw the spacer up against the leg there, and we now end up with and that's just hand tight, and it's already pulled the disc across. So let me just zoom out here. What I discovered was that spacer in there is not a standard one. The standard one would have been plated steel, and it's an aluminium spacer. So I'm going to pull the spindle out, and I'll show you that spacer. But just first, I'll show you another little thing that I'm probably going to do. This casting here is the speedo drive, which is not used on this race bike. So it covers up the gear on the wheel that would have driven the speedo, but it also forms a spacer which doesn't butt up against the slider. It butts up against the shoulder on the spindle. So the spindle butts up against the spacer, which butts up against the bearing spacer tube, the other bearing, the other spacer, and it all gets clamped against the other fork leg. Then this larger diameter is free to float until you tighten the pinch bolt. And the idea is that you get everything together and you bounce the forks and get everything in its best alignment before tightening up the pinch bolt. Anyway, I'll get the spindle out, and I'll show you the spacer as it exists now. Okay, so here's the spacer, which is, simple kind of stepped thing. You can see there's a little bit of wear on it where it runs against the seal. The seal, I'm looking in there and it looks like it is an open bearing. I must admit I normally convert to a sealed bearing, and certainly on a race bike you could go to a sealed bearing and get rid of the lip seal. Whilst I got the wheel out, I'll have a feel of how good the bearings are. So, this has obviously been made, and it looks like it's been made out of something else, because you've got that radius cut on there, which wouldn't be the easiest thing to create. You'd normally go for a square shoulder. Not particularly well machined on that face, but this face, this thing appears to have been sawn and filed, and even just looking at it I can see that the face isn't running true, and you saw that gap which was approaching nearly a millimetre. So I'm going to have to make a new spacer, and I'm sure I've got a stock spacer sitting on the shelf. I've probably got several, but actually laying my hands on one to take some measurements off, I can't just do it quickly, so I'm probably just going to make a new spacer, and make it, a couple of millimetres longer with this one, and do some trial fitments to get that get the disc centralised in the caliper, and sort it that way. Once I've done an initial measurement, I can probably just take a one simple finish cut and get that centralised. So that's what we'll do. and then put this back together. Well, these are new spacers plus the old one on the right, so you know, very basic machining job. This one came out at 22mm, seemed to give the right offset, and the one on the left is 19 to replicate the old speedo drive. So we'll get the wheel fitted back in and tightened up, and then check again if the offset in the caliper looks correct. On the right hand side of the bike we've got the new speedo drive gear cover and the new spacer to replace the old speedo drive cover, and around the other side we have the new spacer installed, and all I've got to do now is get the wheel slotted back into the calipers and the spacers between the legs and the spindle back through, and this is a little bit of a juggling act. What I've been using to make this reasonably easy is this little block of wood, and perhaps some of you might recognise this. This is actually part of the standard toolkit supplied with a particular iconic car, so be interesting to see if anybody, well, I'm sure these days of the internet someone will recognise this almost instantly, but yeah, put it in the comments if you know what that came from. This is quite a difficult thing to get a good shot of. Just move the light down a little bit, that's better. But that disc is pretty much centralised in what is the left hand caliper from the seated position, and this is the one where the position is set by the new spacer, as you can see in there, and I did skim it down to 21.5mm, which I believe may be the stock dimension, and you can see that the spacer on the other side, there's a gap between the fork leg and the spacer, and that's because it's up against the shoulder on the spindle, and when I get the bike down off the bench, I'll slacken off the fork brace. This is an aftermarket Tarozzi fork brace, and bounce the forks, get this side settled, and then do the clamp up, and this side is pretty much centralised too anyway, and hopefully it will remain so when the fork is settled into its ideal position. So I think that's a completed job, and move on to the next one.